Good afternoon, everyone. Hard to follow you, so don't you try. Full confidence. All right. I've titled my response to Professor Gordon's lecture. Oh, by the way, my response is available on the website, so if you want to look it up and follow along, you can do that. I've titled my response to Professor Gordon's keynote address, Reunited, Metaphysics, Moral Responsibility, and the Incarnation. At the outset, I am honored and humbled to have been extended an invitation to address such a fine group of thinkers who embody the healthy intellectual curiosity that so attracted me to philosophy. Yishen, thank you for this invitation, and my thanks to all in attendance who will listen to my response today, both in the room and online. I'm also honored and humbled for another reason. Responding to a scholar of Lewis R. Gordon's caliber is, I think, no small task. When I taught African American philosophy at Whitman College in the spring semester of 2024, Professor Gordon's landmark text, Existentia Africana, Understanding Africana Existential Thought, groundbreaking at the time of its publication nearly 25 years ago, and a classic text in Black existentialism today, was an essential text on my syllabus that my students and I pored over with assiduous care. Professor Gordon's essays on Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Africana religious thought were eye-opening and inspiring for the students, and an essay that I found particularly compelling and that I continue to read is Can Men Worship? As its invitation to reflect on gender and theology is an intellectual gift that keeps on giving. So I take seriously this remarkable, dare I say, blessed opportunity to respond and say to Professor Gordon, thank you for such thoughtful remarks and for being so gracious as to indulge my response to them. I can only hope that my response is worthy of what you have already shared with us. Again, Professor Gordon, thank you. I must also say a word about how thankful I am to read of Professor Gordon's familiarity with Adventism through his beloved Aunt Lucille. It is refreshing to know that she was able to find community among the Adventists. On this score, Aunt Lucille is in good company, for it was Malcolm X who recounted in his autobiography the care and kindness of an Adventist community directed toward his family when he was growing up in Nebraska. He wrote of this community in his autobiography that, quote, the Adventists felt that we were living at the end of time, that the world was soon coming to an end. But they were the friendliest white people I had ever seen. Close quote. As the only Adventist in my family, I have often wondered how my other family members perceive the Adventist community to which I belong. And so it is good to know that Professor Gordon not only has a deep love for his aunt, but also an appreciation for the Adventist Church, which gave her a sense of community and belonging that each person longs to have and indeed needs to have. Even as Professor Gordon has dedicated today's lecture to his beloved Aunt Lucille, I dedicate my response to every Adventist who, like me, finds themselves the only Adventist in their family, searching for community in a world that is rapidly waxing cold under the frigid clutch of the relentless juggernaut-like march of technology that theoretically unites and connects, but practically divides and alienates, dehumanizing so many in its wake in the name of efficiency. May each of you find communities of authenticity, warmth, and belonging in the Adventist Church, even as its generational narratives of robust family support and doctrinal exactitude too often occlude conversion narratives of isolation from family and unhealthy attachments to Adventism. People relinquish much when they convert to Adventism. May we always provide them with healthy community in return. Indeed, may lone Adventist converts like myself find the comfort that Professor Gordon's beloved Aunt Lucille found in the Adventist Church. As Hans Georg Gadamer reminds us, we each have a hermeneutical horizon against which we interpret texts, a horizon that determines what a text means to us. Professor Gordon has just presented us with a compelling text in the form of remarks on freedom. And insofar as my horizon influences the meaning I give to those remarks, my summary of them is inherently my response to them. I thus summarize what I believe Professor Gordon means by his remarks, and then my response shifts to a more affirmative engagement with his text, in which, on one hand, I try to expand on his insightful reflections on freedom, while on the other hand, remaining squarely within the story of the fall of Adam and Eve, a story with which Professor Gordon is deeply engaged in his remarks. Professor Gordon begins his reflections on freedom by pointing out that he is addressing not just philosophers, but rather, quote, an audience of philosophers and theorists, close quote. Such a distinction is welcome in that, as Gordon points out, philosophy and philosophers have a tendency to problematically install themselves as the ultimate arbiters of intellectual and moral legitimacy. In the vein of Kierkegaard and perhaps Husserl, Gordon calls for a, quote, teleological suspension of disciplinarity, an epoche or a leap of sorts, out of our disciplinary traditions long enough to see the value in the reflections of others who do not share our academic training. Gordon is telling us here that we have much to learn from one another if we can temporarily see beyond ourselves. Here, Gordon is drawing from his important 2006 text, Disciplinary Decadence, Living Thought in Trying Times. There, Gordon emphasizes the need to avoid philosophy ontologizing itself despite its inevitable decay, resulting in a phenomenon in which each academic discipline retreats to its own corner, declaring every other discipline to be illegitimate because of its incongruence with the self-importance of its own fabricated, self-imposed disciplinary standards. Standards in scare quotes. That can be found, or that discussion can be found on page 33 of Disciplinary Decadence. Here, I am reminded of two other criticisms of disciplinary decadence that, along with Gordon's examples, ring true. First is Horkheimer's and Adorno's analysis in Dialectic of Enlightenment. There, Horkheimer and Adorno, emphasizing the profound relationship between myth and enlightenment, help us to see both the failure of enlightenment as a myth and that mythology was already a form of enlightenment. Enlightenment is mythology precisely because the installation of the intellect, reason, knowing self, as the standard bearer has made us more barbaric than enlightened. Second, I am reminded of Richard Rorty's article, Philosophy is a Kind of Writing, an essay on Derrida, in which Rorty claims that philosophy is simply one way of articulating the world. There are others. For example, what is the story of Icarus but a literary articulation of Aristotle's golden mean? And what is the golden mean but a philosophical articulation of the story of Icarus? Going too far away from the mean in either direction, too close to the sun or too close to the sea, impedes virtue. Gordon's framing of his remarks on freedom in this way sets the stage then for an account of freedom that is unimpeded, free, if you will, from a decadent hermeneutics of self-preservation in the form of a stone, and more like the free-flowing hermeneutics of learning and interdisciplinary engagement in the form of a river. Gordon's framing of his remarks is conducive to communal learning, the task we have embarked upon today. In this context, Professor Gordon emphasizes the contradictions of freedom in the United States. Gordon points out that these contradictions were rationalized in part through the specious diagnosis of drapetomania, a supposed condition in which slaves who longed for freedom were thought to be psychologically dysfunctional. Then, moving beyond the synoptic histories of modern philosophy, which contrasts Thomas Hobbes as advocating for a freedom from, Gordon calls this liberty, and John Locke as advocating a freedom to, Gordon calls this freedom, Gordon implicitly and deftly situates Hobbes and Locke within the broader historical understanding of freedom that comes from ancient East African texts. Thus decentralized, Hobbes and Locke cease to be starting points for reflections on the difference between liberty and freedom, as Gordon puts it, and become instead simply two more voices in the debate. The importance of Gordon's move here cannot be overstated because it is a mode of resistance to Hobbes and Locke's hypothetical thought experiments about states of nature, abstractions that, as Charles Mills unceasingly and justly reminded us, miserably fail to account for historical instances of oppression and thus do more harm than good in the cause of justice. Put in Christian theological terms, Hobbes and Locke transform the flesh of oppression into the abstract logos of justice understood as rights and equality in a Rawlsian sense, and thus rather than make the word of God flesh, John 1:14, they make the flesh an abstract word. Gordon then returns to the story of Adam and Eve. His account here is existential, drawing upon notions of, in his words, agency, belonging, and legitimacy, which he terms core themes of freedom. Kierkegaard comes to mind here, where, in the concept of anxiety, writing through his pseudonym Vigilius Halfmensis, meaning the watchman of Copenhagen, he distinguishes between the notion of original sin, what Halfmensis calls dogmatics, and the internal dimensions of human behavior, what Halfmensis calls psychology. Halfmensis has no trouble flirting with the Pelagian heresy, for his aim is to radically reorient Christians in the Danish state church to the moral complexities of Christianity, and to do this, he must problematize sin as the agony of temptation that precedes it, rather than as a perfunctory explanation of original sin that follows it. Indeed, each person radically reintroduces sin into the world with each sin as if for the first time. I believe that Gordon, in reading the Genesis account of the fall as he does, is trying to do something similar, to remind us that the prohibition of eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil at once makes us free and responsible for that freedom. This is, for Gordon, a responsibility from which we shrink in fear and in existential bad faith, which he discusses by noting that, quote, we could embrace freedom or flee it. Existence has much sport with us, with this one, for even fleeing freedom is an act of freedom, close quote. In Sartrean terms, from being in nothingness, to not decide is to decide, and we are thus condemned to be free. True to his teleological suspension of disciplinarity, Gordon understands the search for meaning as, quote, not the province of philosophy alone. He thus turns to psychoanalysis, phenomenology, and developmental psychology to discuss the freedom of Adam and Eve in terms of child development. Liberty is a childlike state in which we seek an unencumbered freedom from. For Gordon, quote, we live the echo of a time of presumed safety in which the world was inhabited by gods who, albeit overwhelming in power, also protected us. They afforded in that protection space in which we could play and, as Sigmund Freud observed, live a primary wish of one day becoming grown-ups, close quote. To be at liberty is to be in a childlike state that protects us from responsibility. We are exposed to responsibility in an adolescent condition when we realize the imperfections of our parents and the demand that we be responsible for our actions. This is then when we are tempted to bad faith. Gordon then turns to a discussion of right and left political ideology. The right is understood as a naive attempt at conservatism, at going back to the way things used to be, as a sort of bad faith response to the responsibility of human freedom. Gordon refers to the political right as a, quote, descent into a juvenile consciousness disguised as a quest for freedom, close quote, that celebrates, quote, a world of libidinal pleasures, tantamount to, quote, an orgy of consumption in which responsibilities for safety are left in whatever or whoever functions as the father. The reverie lacks maturity because with that comes responsibility, close quote. The right wants liberty without responsibility, and the left is no better off, for it deploys the rhetoric of elimination in opposition that collapses into the same false moralism as the right. With either extreme resulting in the infantile, what are we to do? We must, according to Gordon, look to our childhood and adolescence as free beings. A clue is found in what we do at the realization of our freedom. Rather than collapsing into bad faith, we must, quote, take on the difficult task of building a world suitable for life, which includes its cultivation from childhood to maturity, close quote. For Gordon, we must assume a joyful sense of responsibility, not frivolously, but rather in risking ourselves, in making ourselves vulnerable for the sake of community. Here I am reminded of Derrida's notion of the autoimmune, an image taken from medical science that Derrida makes political, and that is act here. Even as the more an organism protects itself and in the very act of doing so does itself harm, so do we, in existential bad faith attempts at self-protection, avoid the responsibility to and for others that community demands. Gordon concludes his remarks with 4 key themes that emerge in the mature construction of such a world that avoids bad faith: dignity, building just political institutions, aesthetic creativity, and a broad conception of health as, quote, the coordination of meaningful ways of living and growing despite the challenges life offers, which in turn implies a perpetual self-growth. We must, in Gordon's words, build lives worth living. Such a world is admirable indeed, and one in which we must see ourselves as capable of constructing, or at least attempting, with all we have to construct. I now turn to my attempt at expanding Gordon's view of the fall to encompass not only the existential effects of freedom in a psychological, existential sense, but also the nature of the fall as a consequence of philosophy itself. Professor Gordon's remarks develop an existential interpretation of the fall. We now extend this view to consider it as a philosophical moment, as a moment in metaphysics, a moment that transforms reality. Consider the nature of God's prohibition in Eden. Adam and Eve are told not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that they eat of that tree, they will surely die. Why would God do such? Why would God issue such an injunction? Is knowledge off limits to human beings? Is intellectual curiosity the bane of God's creation? What, after all, could possibly be wrong with knowledge? Does not God want his creation to think? Indeed, God is all wise and his creation is made in his image. How then could human beings be prohibited from partaking in an activity, the acquisition of knowledge, in which the God who made them also partakes? What exactly is wrong with this picture? Questions abound. It is not that knowledge is off limits in the story of the fall, for God does not prohibit knowledge in the story of the fall as knowledge as such, but rather as a specific kind of knowledge, a knowledge of good and evil. Good and evil are intended not merely as objects of knowledge, but rather as principles of moral action. So, to seek a knowledge of good and evil is to untether them from human conduct. If good and evil become objects of knowledge, then human beings develop rational discursive capacity, enabling them to speak of good and evil abstractly, regardless for how good and evil are supposed to be performed. The fall is then the quintessential philosophical triumph of metaphysical and epistemic capacities over morality. With a knowledge of good and evil untethered from human activity, we are now living in a new reality in which one can theorize about good and evil, and indeed about the world itself, and we can do so at the expense of others. Our moral concern for the neighbor, one of the two great commandments, languishes deep beneath the weight of our various theories and explanations about the world, which again are chiefly concerned with the viability of our rational explanations, not with the well-being of others. With good and evil being objects of knowledge, our moral sensibilities at the fall were exchanged for metaphysical preoccupations. In other words, we would rather explain the world than love the neighbor. Reality at the fall then became a metaphysics of explanation and epistemic justification. This is why Augustine inverts the entire philosophical enterprise by subordinating understanding to faith. It is because Augustine understood that the world since the fall had become understanding first, ethics later. Indeed, Leibniz did not invent the principle of sufficient reason, he discovered it. The theological dimensions of Leibniz's discourse on metaphysics are ultimately an attempt to explain the world that is as old as the world itself, precisely because it is the informality of reason over morality thematized and made philosophical. There are more examples. Consider the man born blind in John 9, verses 1 through 3. Jesus' disciples saw this man and, true to their fallen condition, sought rational explanations for his blindness before recognizing his humanity. And what of Job's friends? Did they not seek to explain his condition without regard for his sorrow and suffering? What of Moses, who demanded to see God's front, but was only allowed to see his backside? Moses' demand was a philosophical demand for anteriority. He wanted to explain God from a frontal, rational view, but ultimately God would only show Moses his backside. Moses' example is compelling, for it has ecclesial dimensions. We attend church, in part at least, to praise God for what he has done, regardless of our understanding. We do not attend church to rationally explain what God has done. If you do attend church for that reason, I feel very sorry. The anterior of God is a propositional religion of explanation, whereas God's posterior is a poetic religion of praise. Against the backdrop of this new fallen reality of metaphysics, we can conveniently avoid responsibility because good and evil are objects of knowledge rather than principles of moral action. The metaphysics of a world in which good and evil are untethered from human behavior is a metaphysics without ethics, a metaphysics without responsibility, a logos without sarx, that is, an abstract word without concrete moral embodiment, disposed to oppress and then justify the oppression with reason of a corrupt sort, like the corrupt theological arguments that justified American chattel slavery. What are we to do? Strangely enough, the history of philosophy provides several examples of attempts to undo the damage that it did at the fall. We find these examples in Socrates, Plato, Kant, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger, and many voices and many sources in Black philosophy. Time constraints limit me to a discussion of Socrates and Plato, but I will happily entertain questions on Kant, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and Black philosophy during Q&A. Nietzsche's critique of Socrates and the birth of tragedy notwithstanding, Socrates attempts to unite the epistemic and the ethical through his claim that one cannot do good accidentally. For Socrates, one's disposition toward the good must be to know what it is so that one can aim at it and do it. Knowledge of the good is for Socrates not an end in itself, but rather is a means to an end. This is why in Book 1 of the Republic and Euthyphro, it is so important to know the definitions of justice and piety, respectively, not merely to know them for the sake of knowledge, but rather for the sake of actually doing them. And Plato, in Republic, analogizes the sun to the summum bonum, the highest good, arguing that it is necessary to guide the eyesight, which, unlike any of the other senses, needs a, quote, third kind of thing to help discern what is true. Here I am brought back to Gordon's remarks on theory as a kind of seeing. If theory is seeing and sight is incomplete, then humanity needs the highest good represented in the sun analogy to help us know the good so we can do it. Again, our sight alone can be misleading, and even if perfectly functional, cannot see without light, that third kind of thing, that good, untethered from human behavior at the fall. The philosophical examples of how to reunite the metaphysical and epistemic with the moral are important, but I close with the theological solution that perhaps, raises as many questions as it answers, that of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. If humanity fell because it separated knowledge from moral action at the fall, it was the incarnation of Jesus that sought to reunite what had been parted. As the Word of God made flesh, Jesus lives a life enabling him to see those whom metaphysics has excluded. When his disciples saw in the man born blind one who they desperately wished to explain, Jesus simply saw a man. Where the disciples saw an exercise in metaphysical explanation and epistemic justification, Jesus saw a person. Nearly every miracle Jesus performed was performed as a radically reconnected, healthy self, an intellect tethered to a strong moral sensibility, the Word made flesh, beholding a world which so badly needed to see an example of love for the neighbor. And above all this, consider the difficulty of rationally explaining the incarnation. It is difficult precisely because it is intended to frustrate the metaphysical preoccupations that have predominated since the fall. No need to explain the fullest embodiment of the intellect and moral action Instead, keep the two connected and do what is right by oneself and by the neighbor. In conclusion, Professor Gordon gives us much to consider in his thoughtful remarks today. If I could tell someone about his lecture in 2 words, I would say, grow up. May we mature from liberty to a freedom that embraces radical responsibility with dignity, just political institutions, aesthetic creativity, and good health. And may we see the fall as much as a philosophical problem as an existential psychological problem. Professor Gordon's reflections on freedom and avoiding responsibility are, I think, tied directly to the fall as a philosophical event, a triumph of reason over moral action that transforms reality into a metaphysics of explanation and justification without regard for responsibility for the neighbor. Philosophy has the resources to overcome itself, but perhaps none are as compelling as the Christian theology of incarnation, understood as a phenomenon that at once overcomes explanation while itself being unexplainable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Golden. For the next 10 to 15 minutes, we have opportunity for Q&A. So I would like to turn the time over to the audience. Raise your hand and I'll roll the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gordon, for your talk. As you were talking, I was thinking about an experience I had a number of years ago. I was conducting field research in Peru. I was interviewing individuals who had been involved with the Shining Path insurgency in Peru in the 1980s, Sendero Luminoso. And I was speaking to a man who was a highly educated man. He was a psychologist, and he had joined this movement. And I was especially interested in his moral reasoning about certain horrific massacres that the movement, Sendero Luminoso, had committed. It completely annihilated a village, Lucanamarca. And I wanted to know how much violence is justifiable in your view. So I asked him that question. In order to achieve communist utopia, how much violence? And I'll never forget his answer. He said to me, "Si es necesario, ríos de sangre." If necessary, rivers of blood. So when I was hearing you talk about, for example, some of the pathologies, maybe that's the best word, of the right, the drive for perfection, the inability to question the self, the heavy moralism, and so on. It just struck me that all of these things, and you kind of gestured in that direction, I think, that the left is also capable of these things, right? But it seems to me it's more than just capable. And if I bring it more to a more mundane level, not something as dramatic as the Shining Path, but just my own vocation as a professor, as an instructor, I oftentimes find myself afraid to assign to my own students certain books that I think would be vital for them to engage with, not because the books are necessarily right, but because it would stimulate thoughts that are worthy of serious consideration and discussion. And yet, I oftentimes hold back and I don't assign these books. Now, what kinds of books are these? It's never books articulating positions on the left. It's books that are more conservative in their leanings, so whether it's questions about gender or race or colonization or things like that. I'm afraid. I'm afraid of my own students, and I'm afraid of my colleagues. So I think when I think about like, what does it mean to love the neighbor? I want to know, what does it mean to love the neighbor within an intellectual community where conservative thought, conservative traditions are not only pathological, but sometimes actually thoughtful, profound, even noble in their own ways. They have integrity, you know, and yet it feels like it's becoming harder and harder in our highly polarized culture to simply even have a space where many viewpoints can be considered. Viewpoints that aren't only radical. I mean, Marx, Sartre, great. Let's make sure the students engage with those thinkers. We can't forget Sartre's attraction to Stalinism, for example, or Marx's defense of colonialism in India. There's issues, you know, there on the left as well that have to be wrestled with. And so, anyways, I would love to hear your response to that. Maybe Timothy, your response as well. What does it mean to love the neighbor, intellectually speaking, where conservative traditions might also have something to say in our learning spaces?
Thank you for asking that and for formulating it the way you did. There's several things, and you know, as you brought up even around Peru, I have a student I'm mentoring right now who went through that, and I'm mentoring him for his master's, and as he goes through issues with his relationship with his father, who was a policeman. There's there's several things. The first thing is what I was outlining is the problem of I mean, a lot of the things that area we call conservatism today is really neoconservatism. All right, classical conservatism is very different. And indeed, what I've found, you know, when I mentioned that I also teach ancient East African writers, I also teach people, for instance, whether they're Robert Nisbet, or whether it's Aucassin, or whether it's Nietzsche, or Kierkegaard. You know, a lot of people don't realize that Kierkegaard was a conservative. So it creates an interrogation of what conservatism is, okay? The conservatism I was talking about is not simply about a naive association with party affiliations. The conservatism I'm just talking about is the notion of final solutions. And that's why that was what put me in a position to be able to give a critique of the kind of left that I made the critique of. In fact, you know, some of you know, I'm not just a professor, I'm also known for a lot of political work. And I've been in a very, very difficult path here because, you know, I write on people like Frantz Fanon and others, and there are people who would imagine, for instance, that I would be supportive of something like what Hamas did last year. So when I came out and said, no, that's not revolutionary or libertarian. But then people try to push people into a very narrow defined conception of that struggle, because they have to point out what Lehud is doing. And, you know, it's not that you can't just simply say killing that many people is right. Part of an adult's sensibility is understanding that there are times that we can be facing both sides being wrong in an issue. And it requires having a different question of how we relate to that issue. So when we come to something like how to think through conservative thinkers, one of the things, I mean, in this talk, I was just trying to frame it in a certain way, and I also was trying to find around time. Because in my longer discussions, I elaborate the distinction between reductive leftism and what would be a form of mature critical position. But there is something rather interesting that I didn't talk about that I think, and what I'm saying, the short version is I do teach them. And I would encourage you to as well. But I teach Nietzsche. There are people who absolutely hate Nietzsche. But you know, there are things with Nietzsche that I found very important. And among them is, for instance, in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy from the State of Music. Nietzsche identified something that I think we should all take very seriously. And that is the naivety of Nietzsche's time, and Kierkegaard noticed this too, was the presupposition that dialectical thinking was intrinsically progressive. But if you look at Nietzsche's analysis, Nietzsche actually identified something rather profound, which was that there can be a regressive dialectic. And a regressive dialectic is a dialectic that pushes you into polar opposition. All right? So a lot of people miss this because when he gave his discussion of the Aeschylean, right, formulation of tragedy, it was with the relational, multifaceted community of women and men, music and dance, the chorus. The Sophoclean moment, which would shock a lot of people, which is the moment of philosophy, Socrates, he defined as the decadent moment. Because it's the moment when patriarchy emerged, when the men took over thought. A lot of people thought the antidote would be the Euripidean moment, when the woman will strike it back, because Euripides is known as the poet of the woman. But what Nietzsche identified was that polar opposition. That ultimately a healthy society has interaction and dialectical movements without a pre-given conclusion of where they're going. I think that's very healthy. And I think that's really profound. And it's also interesting enough what Fanon argued in his critique of Sartre, which is why Sartre went to the critique of dialectical reason, because Sartre, as you pointed out, took a naive, orthodox Stalinist presupposition of a foregone conclusion of dialectical reasoning. That's what Fanon pointed out via Nietzsche, is that that's a non-dialectical dialectic. In other words, it was really aggressive. But what that means then is, what are we doing when we actually communicate with one another? And I had a wonderful conversation earlier around this at lunch, which is that what many people are looking for is a false dilemma, the dilemma between optimism and pessimism. When the human world is a world in which we struggle with the question of our commitments for what we're going to build. It's not, in other words, we don't need to know the outcome. We need to meditate on the value of our actions. And because in those actions, we don't take ourselves so seriously that we block the capacity of subsequent generations to emerge. So throughout my career, I've actually taught not as a buffet style model of conservative thinking. I don't want to teach a thinker perfunctorily. When I teach a conservative thinker, it's because that person is saying something. But the thing that's tricky and the disgrace of today is those are thinkers that the people who today identify conservatives will not listen to because they only want to know whose side those thinkers would be on. And that is the danger facing the left, because there are people on the left today who don't want to know why you're thinking, what you're doing, or even understanding that you're a fellow human being who is valuable. They only want to know whose side are you on. And that is the polar opposition that takes us out of the dialectics of building human communities. You could probably guess even my reading when I talked about Genesis 2, not in the cliche dialectical sense, but more complex dialectical sense of bringing out the contradictions of responsibility. That is one of the things I think we should bring to our students.
Yeah, I was just going to say briefly, as a matter of pedagogy, I think it's my obligation to take students out of this polarized left, right, progressive, conservative model. Because the fact of the matter is, for reasons that Professor Gordon just said, and for many others, I, for instance, as a Black male, I'm not at home on the left. I'm just not. In particular, if I'm heterosexual, I'm certainly not at home on the left, right? And I'm not at home on the right either, right? So I occupy this space sort of in between the two, and meanwhile, society and the church is trapped in this polarity of whose side are you on, right? And for me, that becomes a problem because what I try to tell my students is that these are issues not of right and left, but of right and wrong. And when we allow our politics to invade our pedagogy to such a degree, I mean, call me naive, but, college, I think, ought to be a place where you can see further than the world around you, right? And academics ought to be that space where you can do that. And you can't do that if you give into a politics that controls your pedagogy such that students leave college thinking that police reform is a liberal progressive issue when it isn't, right? Any taxpaying citizen ought to be upset if there is a segment of the population that does not have faith in the criminal justice system. That is not an issue of left or right. That's an issue of right and wrong. And so I try to convince my students of that. And the other thing I try to do is I try to prevent the students from reading their contemporary political sensibilities into the text. Somebody the other day got mad at me and they said, well, Dr. Golden, Plato was just a fascist and he just wants military music played in the Callipolis and blah, 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 blah. And I said to the student, I said, you're reading today's standards into this ancient text when the reality is Plato was deeply troubled because there was no specialization in Athens. Anybody could take any other person to court for any reason at any time. Nowadays you have to be a lawyer, right? It's technical, it's highly specialized. Back then you didn't have to do that. And I try to get my students to realize that regardless of how we see things today, and we all come to college with our conservative or our liberal leanings, and we start reading these great thinkers and we just pigeonhole them as if the things they were concerned about are the same things you're concerned about today, when the fact of the matter is, do people in these ancient texts have problems? They may have lots of them, but you can't really give them a chance if you don't sort of suspend your own ideas about them and try to take them for what they were actually grappling with at the time. So those are things that I try to do. I don't know how successful I am, but I try.
So I've always felt like an interloper in this meeting because I'm really trained in theology officially and not in philosophy. So this is a little bit, this will reveal that. But I was recently invited to go to a Sabbath morning discussion circle that Jim Walters is responsible for leading, and was asked to comment on this question: where should Adventist theology go from here? And my answer to that question was that it should seek reasons for hope. And so what I would be interested in, both of you commenting on, is if we put responsibility on every human being to act in a way that will build a world that we need, what reasons do we have for hope?
I think also again,
Okay, my response, so my question is somehow related to the concern that was expressed, and I take that question almost personally because I happen to be to have been, I should say, a professor in the seminary, the most conservative, setting which you could see in the LH's history. I feel challenged by your question. I think it's a good question. It's the right question. And I like, in a way, your response that want to do the right job, you need to transcend the label and be concerned essentially with your, not only with your freedom, but with your responsibility. And in other words, freedom and responsibility should come together. And I would like to come back to the, in connection to that, to, your observation about Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a very good friend of mine. He was in college, I was a defender. In our class, there were two camps, and there was the Rousseauist and Voltairian. And I was with Rousseau and against Voltaire. And with the age, I changed a little bit. What is interesting about Rousseau is that we read in our classes the ideal of his education and and other things which he wrote in his confessions, and he his whole idea was freedom. No, the good savage man, just no ties. So much so that Voltaire got very upset at it. And he says, when I listen to Rousseau speaking, I feel like going outside and eating grass. It's a response to Rousseau. In other words, and what is intriguing and perhaps really disturbing about Rousseau, who was, promoting freedom, is that he, for instance, in his life, he, though he encouraged the value of education and so forth, he had children who didn't care, and he left them. So there was serious ethical problem. He was for freedom with no responsibility, and so in the tension which I perceived here, which I heard, I think the direction should be going that we have not been very good in with the tension, and this is why we have left and right in the church, which is a scandal, because the church has nothing to do with right and wrong, with right and left, but it has to do with right and wrong. And I think this needs to be, this thinking, this discussion should come to us more, to make us think and learn to be free. That's a loving lover of the truth, but with responsibility. And that's a challenge.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just say in response to your question, what reason do we have to hope? For me, I have, and I'll just use this as an example. For others, it may be different. I've always understood, as a Black man growing up in the United States, I've always understood the greatness of our country to lie in the people who occupied the space between her rhetoric and her reality. And the people who stood in that space and never told us that it was time, like, Machiavelli says, if you can't meet the ideal, you need to lower the ideal, right? And I think the people that have inspired me have always kept the ideal where it is, and they've worked very hard, Black and white, male and female, so many people across the spectrum, and you could call the roll, right? But for me, the hope is that spirit will continue. I have very little hope that we will ever eradicate any of the problems that we have this side of eternity. But I have lots of hope that there's enough people who will keep trying to do that, and that even if we can't do it, right? I'm reminded of a guy who wrote an introduction to Kant's philosophy, and the first sentence was, just because something is impossible doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do it. Right? And that's, I think, where my hope lies, is that as I look back, in one sense, as I look toward the future, it looks bleak, but as I look back, I see something that I think is a spirit that can be maintained. And my hope is not that things will, be perfect, but that we will keep trying. And that's where I am.
So if I might,
Yeah.
it's this side of the kingdom remark that you made, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think we are living at a time where there's widespread belief that there is no kingdom. That is, in fact, there's no father,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no prospect of actually achieving the ideal. And it's that's what interests me.
Sure.
Whether or not we have some basis for assuming that the efforts that we make are in fact preliminary, they are preparatory,
Mhm.
they are sort of anticipatory of actually the ideal arriving. And once one gives up that ideal of it arriving,
Mhm.
then I think the question becomes very, very intense.
Well, what's interesting is, even if, Nietzsche's famous claim, God is dead, right? The death of God, in some sense, means the birth of human responsibility. Because if we no longer hide ourselves behind beliefs, and if we get down to the business of looking each other in the face and saying, I have to really do something to help you, then maybe that's the best we can ask for. Yeah.
I'll shut up.
Yeah.
No, you don't have to.
Yeah.
Well, there's several things. The first thing is, you may notice in my analysis, I did make a distinction between conservatism and the right. And this is very important, mainly because, this right and left thing we talk about came from something arbitrary. It was the seating in French Parliament. Okay, the monarchists sat on the right, the republicanists sat on the left, small R republicanists. The people on the left historically, right, were the people who believed that no one is above the law. The people who are the monarchists believed that the monarch was above the law because that was the source of the law. So that was but there are psychoanalytical dimensions to that, because especially in Romance languages, gauche, left, or even in Latin, sinister, there are all kinds of things associated with the left that are more complicated, whereas control, measurement, and so forth, order, all right, things like that, those are the right. So that's one thing in terms of how we talk about right, left stuff. But in terms of your question and the point even about Rousseau, my point wasn't about, say, the valorization of whether it's Voltaire or Rousseau. I think it's about the extent to which a problem was identified from their thought and how we address that problem. One of the things that we should bear in mind, especially around the question of hope, is sometimes we don't ask ourselves critical questions about who or what we are. You see? I didn't talk about it here, but I think the book that was used, Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, I talked about the distinction between a colonial conception of knowledge and another kind, right? A colonial conception of knowledge is not knowledge, of love. The colonial conception of love is to say you could only love the reproduction of yourself. The other must be the mirror image of you. By the way, that's why I looked at the novel Frankenstein. That's a subtext. Frankenstein was trying to create his mirror. So and Mary Shelley was an anti-colonialist. So the idea, but however, this creature, instead of being his reproduction, became a living being that wanted love, that revealed to Frankenstein the ugliness of trying to force on another the reproduction of the son. So if we understand then that there are other kinds of love we're capable of, one of the things about our humanity is that we're capable of what I call radical love. And radical love is the ability to love that which is not the reproduction of yourself. In fact, a kind of love that celebrates the joys of the other to live their life. Now, within that framework of radical love, the question is, how do you enter a relationship with that love? You can't, if you enter it with a prediction of the outcome, you would have closed off the capacities of that other to be free and have dignity. So it means then that, in effect, it's every act of that kind of love is a demonstration of a commitment to work with to see what will come. And it's rather striking how many aspects of that are in the way we have a lot of social life. The way I look at political activity and why I bother to go to those political questions is because I would argue that freedom without addressing power would be remiss. And institutions of power, social power, those are political. But the thing about them is that many people confuse governing and politics. Governing is the rule, constraint, predictability factors. But politics has a contingency in it. It requires a commitment of trying to make things work where even if you individually fail, the conditions you are setting might be better for others. And this is one of the things, now again, you know I'm Jewish, I'm not Christian, but this is one of the beautiful things embodied in certain Christian stories. Because implicit in the story of the Christian conception of God is the willing to love so much that God, as Simone Weil would point out, is willing to suffer and sacrifice because of the love and beauty of others. Mm. I see that then as a point of something not only inspiring, but something that really clarifies a more important question, which is at the moment, whether it's say you are going to love someone to commit to as a partner, whether it's in marriage, or you're going to love, even though you're not calling that, to commit to someone as a teacher, because every student who comes before you, back to your earlier question, it's not just simply a work relationship. There's an ethical commitment to the growth of that other human being. You don't know that in advance. So what you have to do is to articulate a set of commitments that make you function as a condition of possibility for the flourishing of another. That I see is in such a way that even if it almost makes hope irrelevant, because the commitment, the quality of that commitment means you have work to do. And it makes it such that every time you do the work, you say it's not about you. It's about that which transcends you and is so valuable, it's worth doing. I do think that is the task at hand. And there are some people who, if we put aside those right and left and conservative and whatever stuff, I do think as a species that we, in committing ourselves to the idea of those we do not know, which is subsequent generations, we have also rejected the hubris of treating ourselves in such a way that our individual death is the end of the world. In not taking ourselves too seriously, we make not only other worlds possible, but we also make the conditions for other worlds that are livable. I'll leave it at that.